Hello and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. I'm running out of space, but I'm not out yet. So until then, I'm going to keep buying cameras to review. For this next video, we're going to be looking at the Sony A390. It's one of the last CCD equipped alpha mount cameras that Sony made before they made the full switch to CMOS in their DSLR lineup. This camera features some interesting technology and has a lot of interesting design choices when it comes to ergonomic sacrifices. Let's get into it. What is the Sony A390? Well, this is it right here. And this is a entry-level DSLR announced in July of 2010 with the now defunct alpha mount. It features an APS-C size sensor and it has, I think, the highest pixel density of any APS-C CCD equipped camera. And it features a 14.2 megapixel CCD. The ISO ranges from 100 to 3200, and focusing is done using a 9-point AF system, with the center being a cross type. Shooting speed is a kind of pedestrian 2.5 frames per second. However, the camera does also feature IBIS. It's also got dual card slots. Let's have a look. And it has the ability to shoot SD cards or memory sticks. The camera weighs in at 549 grams. Pretty light. That's barely more than a quarter of a knot. Now, when this camera was new, it was $599 in American dollars, or roughly $860 now dollars, roughly 1,180 beaver dollars. Now, for a complete look at the specs, I'm going to link to the DPReview website. It has that online. I was trying to find a wiki entry or, the actual Sony webpage with the A390, but I think it's down now. So, thanks DPReview. Shooting with the A390, start with the neat features. Normally I would talk about the camera's body style and handleableness, but today we're going to start with something positive about the camera. And the first thing that I want to bring up is the neat live view system. Now, this camera is from 2010 and it has a CCD sensor. Those two things don't typically correlate to a seamless live view experience. And after all, in 2010, the Panasonic G1 was only launched a year earlier. However, this didn't stop Sony from trying to make a camera with reasonably good live view. Now, in order to do this, Sony actually didn't use the CCD sensor in the camera to feed the video stream to the back of the LCD. Instead, it uses a secondary sensor embedded in the pentamirror. Now, the system isn't that new. It was actually used in the Sony A350, and it was also a similar system to the one used by Olympus in some of its DSLRs. Now, it's pretty neat overall just because this system allows the camera to have live view while retaining the use of phase detect autofocus points. And that's just because at the time, contrast detect AF was kind of poopy. Now, the way that this works is that the mirror box that you get in the DSLR, where if you had live view, it would normally flip up and you take a feed directly to the sensor. In this camera, that does not happen. The pentamirror has one mirror that is tiltable that changes the optical path from your eyeballs to that secondary sensor. This switch on the top of the camera is what does it. Now, I'll put up an image to show how this works because it's actually pretty neat. So, the result of this system is that the live view in the A390 has reasonably snappy autofocus. Now, combine that with the fact that this LCD is a 2.7-inch 230K dot unit that does do tilties. Means that you actually get the ability to do some pretty good and pretty neat compositions without contorting your body. Now, when I was using this camera, I actually pretty much used it exclusively with my macro lenses and used the live view to go and get some, again, interesting low angle shots without having to basically lie on the ground. Now, you might notice here that it is a bit dark shooting, and you might be able to see that it's kind of dropping some frames. Maybe not, I'm not super sure, but in low light, the sensor does drop frames. Let's quickly have a look at this AF. I'm not sure. Oh, there you go. Hey, it's got my eyeballs. Honestly, not bad for a live view system of the past. Now, overall, this system, I think it's pretty cool, and I give the system a pass. You know, good stuff, Sony. I know what you're wondering. Wow, neat. That's an interesting system. Were there any downsides to this kind of live view? Well, yes, there were. One of them is that due to the fact that there's extra stuff in the pentamirror area, you actually have less space for OVF things. And as a result, the OVF on this unit is kind of small. It looks a bit tunnely, and you might not notice it if you don't have another DSLR beside to have a look at, but if you have another crop camera DSLR, you can immediately notice the difference between an A390 and say the Nikon D200. Additionally, there are some other drawbacks as well. The live view sensor doesn't cover the entire sensor, which makes sense. The OVF only covers 95%, and the live view sensor, all in all, covers about 90% of the coverage, which is not super great. Additionally, you know, if you're using the live view, you may have noticed in here, oh, let's see if you can see it. Hopefully you can see that. There are the 9 AF points in your live view. Let's say you wanted to turn that off. That is actually not possible. No dice there. Since this system, it's actually looking at the live view markings in the penta mirror. So those on this camera don't turn off, and as a result, on the live view, they're always overlaid. Which is just, you know, kind of weird, not necessarily a huge downside, but something to consider. What else does the A390 do? Well, this is a Sony Minolta camera, so it had sensor stabilization, or STAB as the cool kids are saying. Now, it's not unique to this camera, but it is worth noting. Now, in order for users to actually get the most of this STAB, this camera does actually have features that are not always common on other cameras. And there are two things that you'll notice if you use this camera, and they show up in the OVF and in live view, but I'll turn it around. You might see there are two symbols here. One is a flashing hand being like, oh no, you have potential shake in your image. But the neat one is this corner one here. That is a bar graph that indicates how much shake there is. And it's supposed to help you gauge. It's supposed to help you gauge just when you are good to take your shot. Basically, when it is a full bar graph, like all the way maxed out, you have a lot of shake. And if you can stabilize it and get that bar smaller, then you are reducing the shakeage, and it might be a good time to take a photo. Now, this in combination with the fact that you have sensor stabilization will help you in general get more stable shots or maximize the chances of getting a nice stable shot with the sensor STAB. So it's actually, I think, pretty neat. Another feature this camera has is iStart autofocus. Now that isn't the fancy Canon I control autofocus, this is a little simpler. There is simply a sensor in front of the viewfinder so that if you are lifting your eyes towards the finder, the AF system will kind of prime itself and start focusing before your eyes reach the finder. So let's get that a go. Oh, first, camera should probably be awake. See, I didn't press the button, it just started going. Overall, it's a pretty neat idea. I actually personally turn this off since I find that when I'm walking around with the camera, it like swings and I have the camera pass by my pants or whatever, and I can just hear the camera try to get focus on something and it just kind of annoys me. So on mine, I do have it turned off. Now, that being said, overall, I do normally think it is a cool thing. But what else does this camera do? Well, this camera also actually has a wireless flash commander. This is actually a neat feature that's included on, that's not normally included on a budget camera. And the fact that this does have it and it is considered an entry-level camera, just kind of neat. Now, it's not a full-blown wireless flash commander, but you do get abilities to trigger other flashes if they're compatible with the camera. I don't actually have another compatible flash to use with it, so I just take the marketing materials word for it. I assume that it works. Now, the last neat innovation this camera has is again something that you normally do find on higher end cameras, but not on budget cameras, especially at the time, and that's the dual media slots. In this camera, like I said, you can use your SD card slot, or you can use a memory stick duo card, which not useful right now, but at the time, probably pretty cool. Admittedly, despite this feature being a thing on the camera, this is probably one of the worst implementations of dual card slots that you could find. Now, you can't use both card slots simultaneously to write RAWs to one and JPEG in the other or anything like that. You have to actually choose which one to use. So it'll only write to one at a time. And on top of that, you'd think maybe this is a menu item that you can control. Nope, there's a physical switch right there that you have to toggle to select what media you want to write on. So overall, neat that it's there. It's just really one of the weirdest implementations. Shooting with the A390, operation and feel. So this is where things get a little bit janky. The camera itself is a mess ergonomically. First, we'll talk about the grip. Now, this is the profile or the underside of it, and it is quite narrow. It's not super comfortable. And my hands aren't super chunky and I don't have super chunky fingers. But I imagine if you had bigger hands, this would not be great. This is definitely not a nice grip, and it's just really weird since that other cameras they had did do good grips. But if you believe it or not, the A390 was an improvement on what looks to be a ridiculously terrible grip on the A380. And again, it's just weird because the A100 had an amazing grip. It looks like, if you look at pictures of the A350, that grip is also fairly comfortable. But I don't know, I guess at some point they wanted to design the camera to be lighter and sleeker, and so they wanted this narrow grip. It's quite weird. Now, honestly, that's just the start of the weird ergonomic problems. Again, if you have a look at the Sony A350 and you have a look at the back of that camera, it appears to have a fairly nice button layout. It makes sense and it has an effective use of the space on the camera. Now, if you look at the A390, this camera right here, it looks like in the name of streamlining for designing new SLRs for new users, they kind of just removed a lot of stuff. Now, this is a very apparent if you look at the top plate of the camera over here, where you have your shutter button, your live view toggle, and one very stupid smart teleconverter button. And all this empty space. There's just literally nothing there. Now, if you look at the back of the camera, you'll also notice that there are no side buttons. You only have buttons on the right side, which it doesn't sound like a terrible thing because it's just, more access potentially with your right hand. However, there's just buttons that you normally think would be there that are not there. No exposure lock, right? And everything on this camera, like on this D-pad, it has the functions double up. So that's like normal for a budget camera, but the fact that there are so few buttons, it is actually kind of annoying, and it does slow you down when you're shooting. So on top of this weirdness, this camera has only one command dial, and it's in front of the shutter here. That's personally not my preference, and I get for budget cameras, you have less money, so you're stuck combining functions with like button holds and using one command dial or whatever. But in this particular case, it kind of gets in the way more than in other budget cameras. And earlier I mentioned that the OVF is fairly tiny, and I'm going to bring it up again. Again, it is like notably smaller. Again, as I said, if you don't have another camera to compare, it is maybe something you won't notice, and maybe that's what they were hoping when they made the camera. But I do have many cameras, and for reference, if I have a look at the camera, I look through this finder, and I look through, say, the Olympus E1 finder, I find that the E1 finder is actually notably bigger. And that's kind of weird just because the sensor and mirror box in that are much smaller. Now, I know they can diddle the magnification so that you have better view looking through a smaller box, but it's just insane given the sensor size difference that on this camera this finder is smaller. So yeah, overall OVF not a strong point of this camera. All right, back to positivity though. This was when a camera, a stills camera was just a stills camera. So the menu system is actually not a convoluted mess. It's surprisingly straightforward, so you won't really get lost looking at it. There's also just not that many options to go through. Now, let's have a quick look. Yeah, so basically it's like a tabs-based system. You got your camera set up there. You have your gear for some like custom functions, playback, and random other settings lobbed into the back. Your LCD brightness and what you want to do with your HDMI output and stuff. Overall, straightforward, fairly easy menu. All right, back to positivity. So this camera came in from an era when stills cameras were just stills cameras. So the menu on this camera is, very simple. It's not a convoluted mess, quite straightforward if you have a look. Basically, it's split up in like tabs on the top and your options on the bottom, and there aren't that many to go through. So overall, it's quite nice. You won't get lost staring at the back of your camera. Unless, of course, you're using live view, then you're going to get lost staring at the back of the camera, but you're going to be composing stuff, so it's better. One last gripe, though. For some reason, on this camera, the AF button in the D-pad there, it actually does only one thing, and it's not the thing that you think they would do. Having used tons of cameras that have a kind of similar D-pad layout, you press the button, and normally you expect that you press AF on one of these DSLRs, and you expect that it is going to allow you to select focus points. Incorrect on the Sony. For some reason, on this camera, the AF button is an actual AF on button. So I'm going to press the center, and you're going to hear that. Kind of annoying, since I actually had to look up how to change the AF point on this because I was just like kind of baffled that they made this choice, but it turns out it's actually several button clickies. So let's try to do it. So we press our FN and we go to AF area. We are in AF area. Luckily, I'm already in this mode where I'm selecting this spot. And from here, you now have to use your command dial, your one command dial. Oh boy. Oh, my bad. No, sorry, you don't use the command dial. You gotta use the little D-pad. And you can scroll left or right and it'll select and scroll through your AF points. That is horrendously annoying. Shooting with the A390, image quality and autofocus. This is where the A390 gets points back. The 14 megapixel sensor is a notable bump in resolution for CCD APS-C cameras. Now, in the 2010s, this is the era where 16 megapixel CMOS sensors were starting to come in, like the D7 III. So I guess Sony saw that it might be a good time to bump the resolution up on their CCD stuff just to keep pace. So the result of that is that you got 14.2 megapixels, not quite 16, but a pretty good bump up from the 10 that many other CCD cameras had at the time. Now, this is just kind of nice because overall with 14 megapixels, especially now, you get a bit more cropping room. But the sensor also outputs a pretty nice amount of detail in its files. So it's quite a refreshing look when you compare all these other CCD cameras around. And I actually like the images that come out of the sensor, a lot. I was surprised how much detail it was able to extract. Now, I was primarily shooting with this macro lens, and it is a naturally very sharp lens, and it did not disappoint. But overall, the output of the camera from a resolution perspective, quite good. Now, this is all also considering that, again, this is a camera from the 2010s. There is an AA filter over top of this sensor, so it, in theory, does slightly impact resolution to combat moire. However, I find that in this camera, it is quite well tuned, and I don't think you're losing too much detail to that filter. Now, just as a reminder, I do really like shooting RAW. I always have, always will. So I'm not really gonna comment on the JPEG output out of this camera. Honestly, from what I've read and from the very few that I've taken, it is just okay and less than okay at high ISO. Now, on the topic of high ISO, this CCD is pretty high density for a CCD of the era, and that does come at a bit of a price. That price, high ISO performance. You will notice that in photos taken with this camera, you will get color noise creeping in even at ISO 400. At ISO 800 and up, you really can't miss it. Luminance noise also does increase, but it increases in that way that a CCD camera does, and it doesn't look super terrible. Now, that being said, the color noise, that does get fairly hairy. On the topic of high ISO, this high density CCD sensor does come at a price. Now, that price, obviously, high ISO performance. You will notice that in the photos that this camera takes, that you'll start to get color noise kind of at lower ISOs. Even at ISO 400, you'll start to see it creep in. At 800 and up, you really can't miss it. It's there. Now, luminance noise also increases proportionally with your ISO. However, it does so in a way that, CCD sensors tend to do. So it doesn't look that terrible. Now, the color noise, it does look quite bad. However, that is easily removed using modern noise reduction software. So even at high ISOs, the images will still look reasonably solid. You can get quite a bit of detail out of the high ISO RAWs as well. Although I do admit at the 3200 ISO, the luminance noise is kind of more than I would like. And, you know, I tend to be fairly generous with my noise evaluation, but that's just me. But here's the thing though, we'll have a quick look at what the noise performance looks like from A100 to A390. And we'll see how this turns out with and without noise reduction from the RAW editor that I'm using, Raw Therapy. When it comes to autofocus, the system is pretty basic. It is 9 points. Hopefully you can see them on there on the live view. They're clustered near the center, and again, the center one is the only one that's a cross type. As a result, I would recommend for this camera the standard Focus Recompose. It's going to be your friend. Now, that being said, I do find that the sensor or the system itself is reasonably snappy and reasonably accurate, more so than the A100. Now, this camera does do, you know, AF tracking, and, you know, it is kind of not good. I did some light testing, just basically having the camera and moving the camera back and forth, and it sometimes did things okay. But a lot of the times that if you like if your AF marker left your subject even momentarily, it would kind of just be really hopeless. That being said, if you were able to keep that AF sensor right on target, it would generally do an okay job. Now, that being said, this camera is not a speedy shooter. You are looking at 2.5 frames per second, and that's if you're not using the live view. If you are using the live view, it's down to 2. But let's have a quick listen at 2.5 FPS. And there you go, 2.5 FPS. And at least on my camera, the RAW buffer did not have a good time after 3 photos. So if you are planning to do action-y things, really time your shots, and maybe practice with this camera, because it's going to be harder than most, I think. Recommendation. So the A390 goes for kind of a wide range of prices. Seems to be between 60 USD and around 150 USD at the time of writing for the camera. But the majority of them seem to be closer to $60 for body only, so that's fairly cheap. But does that mean that I recommend the A390? Kind of. I actually would say that if you can find an A350, go for that first, since that is basically like, sensor-wise the same sensor in a much nicer package. Now, if you can't find one, you can't find an A350, the A390 is a pretty good alternative, despite the niggles, because the last of the 300 series, the A380, which also has the 14 megapixel sensor, is probably the worst of them ergonomically. So in terms of recommendation, go for the 390, or go for the A300, then 390. And if you're really just can't find any other 300 series and you really want the 14 megapixel CCD, the 380 at a last ditch effort. Now, I do think that the increase in resolution on the CCD is pretty interesting and pretty cool, since I believe only the Sony Alpha A300 line of cameras have these CCDs in them. So that kind of makes them a bit unique, and I personally like the output of the files. Now, at the end of the day, the cameras were not that well regarded in general, at least the 380 and 390 due to their fairly bad ergonomics, but the whole series as a whole, partly because CMOS technology had gotten pretty mature and high ISO was quite good on CMOS at that time compared to its CCD contemporaries. Now, this might be why most of these were kind of forgotten about, and as a result, you probably can find a good deal on any of the three versions of the A300 series, since, they're just not that sought after. But, if you are looking for one of the Dentist, APS-C, CCD, look no further and let your wallet breathe a sigh of relief, since these are very cheap. Like the 350, 380, 390 all sell for roughly the same price. I personally ended up picking mine up with a kit lens for about 40 USD. So that's pretty good. But to bring it all back, if you're into CCD cameras, this particular CCD I think is worth having. It's honestly like quite a nice output, or quite a nice outputting sensor. Now, if you're just looking for an A-mount camera, there are better options, and the ones that come to mind are the more modern SLT cameras that don't have the super tiny finders. And again, at the time, the CMOS technology on those cameras is more mature, and the prices on those cameras are also still fairly low. Conclusion. So that's my take on the A390. The sensor is a sensor made of gold, even if it's encased in something much less than gold. The camera itself also includes some interesting innovations that are, a neat technical showcase to demonstrate that Sony did have drive to try new things. But that's just my take on this camera. What are your thoughts on the A390 or in general the A300 series? Do you have one? Do you like the bigger pixel count? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Till next time. Bye.